I pretended to be poor until my parents' true colors were revealed. It all began on a chilly autumn morning, the kind where frost clings to window panes and breath turns into visible clouds of vapor. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting the frayed edges of my thrift store sweater while examining my reflection with critical eyes. The worn-out jeans, scuffed sneakers, and slightly tangled hair were all part of the persona I had meticulously crafted over the past 6 months, a deliberate transformation from the polished, privileged existence I had known my entire life. This wasn't some impulsive decision born out of rebellion or boredom. It was an experiment rooted in suspicion, doubt, and a gnawing emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. Growing up in a sprawling estate surrounded by manicured gardens and marble floors, I had always been told how fortunate I was. My parents, both successful entrepreneurs who seemed to float effortlessly through high society, had instilled in me the importance of humility and gratitude. They spoke often about their own humble beginnings, weaving tales of struggle and perseverance at family dinners as if they were parables meant to ground us. But something about those stories never quite sat right with me. There was a rehearsed quality to them, like lines memorized for a play rather than genuine memories shared from the heart. And then there was the way they treated people, the subtle dismissals disguised as politeness, the casual remarks laced with condescension when speaking about anyone outside their elite circle. It made me wonder, did they truly believe what they preached, or was it all just a facade? The idea came to me one evening during yet another charity gala hosted at our home. As I watched my mother glide gracefully across the ballroom floor, her diamond necklace catching the light with every step, I noticed how she greeted each guest. To those she deemed important, potential business partners, influential socialites, her smile was radiant, her words dripping with warmth and sincerity. But when a young server accidentally spilled wine on her gown, her mask slipped ever so briefly. Her lips tightened, her voice turned icy, and though she quickly recovered with a forced laugh, I saw the truth beneath the surface. That moment lingered in my mind long after the party ended, planting a seed of curiosity that would eventually grow into this elaborate charade. So here I was, 18 years old, pretending to be someone I wasn't. At first, it felt liberating, a chance to shed the weight of expectations and see the world through fresh eyes. I enrolled in a community college under an assumed name, working part-time shifts at a local cafe to maintain the illusion. My new classmates accepted me without question, bonding over shared struggles and dreams that didn't involve trust funds or private jets. For the first time I felt seen, not as the daughter of wealthy benefactors but as simply me. Yet even as I embraced this new identity, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was playing a dangerous game. What if my parents discovered what I was doing? Would they understand, or would they see it as betrayal? Every day, I walked a tightrope between two worlds, gathering fragments of insight that painted a more complex picture of the people who raised me. There was the time I overheard my father on the phone, his tone sharp and unyielding as he negotiated a deal that would leave dozens unemployed. "Business is business," he said coldly, before hanging up and returning to his usual charm. Then there was my mother, whose seemingly endless generosity toward charities suddenly revealed itself to be less altruistic and more strategic when I stumbled upon documents detailing tax write-offs tied to her donations. Each revelation chipped away at the pedestal I had once placed them on, leaving behind questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. But alongside these unsettling discoveries came moments of unexpected beauty. Like the elderly woman who frequented the cafe where I worked, always ordering the same black coffee and sitting by the window to sketch. She noticed my worn clothes and offered me advice on finding bargains at thrift stores, unaware that I already knew more than she did. Or the single father who dropped off his son at daycare near campus, sharing stories of juggling work and parenthood with quiet pride. These interactions reminded me of the resilience and kindness that existed beyond the gilded gates of my childhood home, qualities I realized I craved far more than any material comfort. Still, the tension between the life I left behind and the one I now lived grew harder to bear. Nights were the worst. After closing my textbooks and turning off the lamp in my tiny rented apartment, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations and wondering if I was being fair. Was I judging my parents too harshly, holding them to impossible standards? Or was I finally seeing them for who they really were? The uncertainty gnawed at me, keeping sleep at bay until dawn crept through the blinds. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to visit the neighborhood park, a place I'd avoided until now because it was too close to home. As I wandered along the winding paths lined with golden leaves, I spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench. It was Mrs. Patel, a retired schoolteacher who lived down the street from my parents' house. She waved when she saw me, her face lighting up with recognition. "You look different today," she remarked as I approached, her sharp eyes taking in my disheveled appearance. "Are you feeling all right?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Something about Mrs. Patel's warm demeanor put me at ease though, and before I knew it, I found myself confiding in her. Not everything, of course. I couldn't risk exposing my secret, but enough to hint at the turmoil brewing inside me. To my surprise, she listened intently, nodding occasionally as if piecing together a puzzle. When I finished speaking, she reached out and patted my hand. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we have to lose ourselves to find out who we truly are." Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways, echoing in my mind like a mantra. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the shadows dancing on the walls, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. The person I pretended to be had started to blur with the person I wanted to become, and the divide between truth and deception was becoming harder to navigate. Yet deep down, I knew I couldn't turn back, not yet. There were still answers I needed, truths I had to uncover, no matter how painful they might be. Over the next few weeks, I became bolder in my quest for clarity. I started volunteering at a nearby shelter, drawn to the raw honesty of the people I met there. One evening, as I served dinner alongside other volunteers, I struck up a conversation with a man named James. He spoke openly about his past mistakes, his struggles with addiction, and the redemption he found in helping others. His vulnerability moved me, reminding me of the courage it took to confront one's flaws head-on. "We're all just trying to do better," he said with a shrug, his voice tinged with both sadness and hope. "Even the ones who seem perfect aren't." His words resonated deeply, forcing me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own motivations. Was I seeking justice, closure, or merely validation for the doubts I harbored? The line between curiosity and obsession blurred with each passing day, pulling me further into a labyrinth of emotions I couldn't escape. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, I felt stretched thin, caught between gratitude for the connections I'd forged and resentment toward the secrets I suspected my parents were hiding. The holiday brought its own set of challenges. Traditionally, our family celebrated with an extravagant feast attended by friends and colleagues, complete with catered meals and live entertainment. This year, however, I insisted on spending the day quietly at home, claiming exhaustion from school and work. My parents reluctantly agreed, though I could sense their disappointment. Sitting around the dining table with only the three of us felt surreal, the absence of guests amplifying the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. As we ate, my mother reminisced about past Thanksgivings, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Remember when you were little, sweetheart?" she asked, smiling fondly at me. "You used to love decorating the tree with your father." Her words triggered a flood of memories, childhood Christmases filled with laughter and presents wrapped in shiny paper. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to bask in the warmth of those recollections, letting the love I felt for my parents wash over me. But then reality intruded, whispering reminders of the cracks beneath the surface. Determined to test the waters, I steered the conversation toward topics I knew would provoke revealing responses. "Do you ever think about selling the house?" I asked casually, watching their reactions closely. My father stiffened, his fork pausing mid-air. "Sell the house?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "Why on earth would we do that?" It seems like such a big place for just the two of you," I pressed, feigning innocence. "And with property values rising, you could make a fortune." My mother exchanged a glance with him, her expression unreadable. "We've built a life here," she said finally, her voice firm. "Some things aren't for sale." Their defensiveness confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that the house represented more than just a physical space. It was a symbol of status, security, and perhaps even shame, hiding secrets I had yet to unearth. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, fueling my determination to dig deeper. As December arrived, bringing with it the promise of snow and holiday cheer, I found myself increasingly torn between two conflicting desires. On one hand, I yearned to expose the truth, to strip away the layers of pretense and force my parents to confront the contradictions in their lives. On the other, I feared the consequences of such revelations, not just for them but for myself. Could I handle the fallout if everything I believed about my family unraveled before my eyes? Or worse, what if nothing changed, leaving me trapped in a cycle of disillusionment and despair? Despite these doubts, I continued my dual existence, oscillating between the gritty authenticity of my new life and the polished artifice of my old one. Each interaction, each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, drawing me closer to the answers I sought. Yet with every step forward, I also felt the pull of unresolved questions, urging me to keep searching, keep questioning, until the full picture emerged. One evening, as I walked home from work, the city lights casting shimmering reflections on the wet pavement, I received a text message from my mother. "Can we talk tomorrow?" It read simply, followed by a string of emojis meant to convey warmth and affection. My heart skipped a beat, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Had they somehow figured out my ruse? Or was this merely a coincidence, a routine check-in disguised as concern? Whatever the reason, I knew one thing for certain: the game was changing, and I needed to be ready. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. My mind raced as I replayed the text message over and over again. Was this the moment I'd been waiting for? The confrontation that would reveal everything, or nothing at all? I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that struck a balance between my two identities, plain enough to blend into my fabricated world but neat enough not to raise suspicion. As I stepped out of my apartment, the crisp winter air hit me like a slap, sharpening my senses and reminding me of how much was at stake. When I arrived at my parents' house, it felt surreal. The grand columns and sweeping driveway were familiar yet foreign now, their opulence clashing with the simplicity I had come to value. I parked my beat-up car, a relic from my thrift store persona, near the side entrance instead of pulling up front, hoping to avoid drawing attention. Taking a deep breath, I walked inside, bracing myself for whatever awaited me. My mother greeted me in the foyer, her smile warm but tinged with something else. Nervousness? Disappointment? It was impossible to tell. She led me to the living room, where my father sat on the couch, his posture stiff and unreadable. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence stretched taut, heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Finally, my mother broke it. "We've noticed some changes in you lately," she began, her voice soft but deliberate. "You seem distant." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing at my father before continuing. "Your grades have slipped, your social life has dwindled, and you're working odd jobs when you could focus on finishing school properly. We just want to understand what's going on." Her concern sounded genuine, but years of observing their polished performances made me wary. Were they genuinely worried about me, or was this another act designed to maintain control? I decided to tread carefully. "I'm fine," I said, injecting a note of casualness into my tone. "Just figuring things out, you know? College is stressful, and work helps me stay grounded." My father leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Grounded? You call waiting tables and living in a cramped apartment grounded? That's not the future we envision for you." His words stung more than I expected. Despite everything, part of me still craved their approval, even as I resented their expectations. But I couldn't let them see how much their judgment affected me. Instead, I countered with a question. "What kind of future did you envision for me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "One where I follow in your footsteps, surrounded by wealth and privilege, while pretending everything's perfect." They exchanged a glance, the kind that hinted at secrets shared behind closed doors. My mother sighed, her composure faltering slightly. "We only want what's best for you," she said. "But sometimes, we worry you don't appreciate how fortunate you are." "Fortunate?" I echoed, incredulous. "Or entitled?" The word hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. My father's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, I thought he might explode. But instead, he took a slow, measured breath. "You think you know so much," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You judge us based on rumors and assumptions, but you have no idea what we've sacrificed to give you this life." His words caught me off guard. Sacrifices? They lived in a mansion, traveled first class, and moved effortlessly through circles most people could only dream of entering. What sacrifices could they possibly be referring to? What sacrifices? I challenged, leaning forward. "Tell me, because I'm curious." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then my mother stood abruptly, pacing toward the window as if seeking solace in the view outside. When she turned back, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Do you remember when you were 10? She asked softly. "The summer we spent traveling across Europe?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure where she was going with this. It had been one of many lavish vacations, filled with castles, museums, and gourmet meals. How could such memories relate to sacrifice? That trip almost bankrupted us, she admitted, her voice trembling. Your father's business was struggling, and we borrowed heavily to keep up appearances. We didn't want you to feel any less privileged than the other children at your school. Her confession stunned me. Growing up, I had always assumed our wealth was limitless, never questioning its source or stability. To learn that they had risked financial ruin to protect my perception of security shook me to my core. And then there was your grandmother, my father added, his tone bitter. When she fell ill, we paid for her treatment out of pocket rather than burdening anyone else. Do you know what that cost us? Years of savings, gone in a matter of months. Memories surfaced, visits to my grandmother's bedside, her frail figure hooked up to machines, my parents' hushed conversations late at night. At the time, I had dismissed them as routine discussions about logistics, never imagining the weight they carried. But why pretend? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. Why not just be honest about the struggles? Would it really have been so bad to admit you weren't invincible? It wasn't about being invincible, my mother interjected, her voice breaking. It was about protecting you. About giving you a childhood free from worry, even if it meant carrying the burdens ourselves. Her words struck a chord, stirring emotions I hadn't anticipated. Part of me wanted to dismiss their explanations as excuses, rationalizations for their behavior. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, recognized the truth in what they were saying. Love, however flawed and misguided, lay at the heart of their actions. Still, I couldn't ignore the contradictions, the dismissiveness toward those deemed less important, the calculated generosity, the sharp edges hidden beneath their polished veneer. If love drove their decisions, why did it manifest in ways that felt so hollow? As the conversation unfolded, I realized the complexity of the situation. Their motivations weren't black and white, they existed in shades of gray, shaped by fear, pride, and a desire to shield me from pain. Yet understanding their perspective didn't erase the doubts lingering in my mind. Could I reconcile the parents who claimed to love me with the ones who prioritized image over authenticity? By the time I left the house, my head spun with conflicting emotions. Gratitude warred with resentment, empathy clashed with disillusionment. I drove aimlessly through the city streets, searching for clarity amidst the chaos. Eventually, I found myself at the park where Mrs. Patel often sat sketching. Spotting her on her usual bench, I approached hesitantly. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her. She smiled warmly, patting the seat. "Of course, dear. Is everything all right?" I hesitated, unsure how to articulate the turmoil swirling within me. Finally, I settled for honesty. "I don't know anymore," I confessed. "I thought I was uncovering truths, but now I'm not sure what's real." Mrs. Patel listened patiently as I poured out my frustrations, offering occasional nods or murmurs of understanding. When I finished, she placed a gentle hand on mine. "People are complicated," she said simply. "Even those we love most carry wounds and fears we can't always see. Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't finding answers, it's deciding what to do with them once you have." Her wisdom resonated deeply, cutting through the noise in my mind. She was right. The revelations I sought weren't meant to justify or condemn. They were tools for understanding, pieces of a puzzle that required patience and compassion to assemble. That evening, as I returned to my tiny apartment, I resolved to approach the remainder of my journey with renewed purpose. No longer driven solely by anger or suspicion, I vowed to seek connection rather than confrontation. Perhaps the truth wasn't something to unearth but something to build, a bridge spanning the gap between who my parents were and who I hoped they could become. Little did I know, the greatest revelation of all was yet to come.